You mentioned earlier that when we were breathing out, breathing in through your nose and out could be mouth or nose. Is there a preference?
Nasal breathing is always better. And I'll give you a few things about your nose. All right. So I don't know how everyone feels about the nose, but you should love your nose. Your nose is the first part of it, literally is you're the first part of your immune system. So there is a filtration system. There's these things called turbinates in your sinuses, and it filters out an enormous amount of what you breathe in, as long as you're breathing in through the nose. It will humidify the air you breathe. It cools or heats the air you breathe. It makes it very as perfect as possible for getting the right absorption and to avoid irritation and inflammation in your alveoli, which are these tiny little sacs in your lungs that are very delicate, and they are where that gas exchange happens. And when we're talking about the turbinates, what happens is, as long as you're not dehydrated, okay, if you breathe through the nose, it's going to pick out a large percentage of all of the little things that are floating in the air that we really, most of the time, we can't see. Sometimes you can see it, but a lot of times you just can't see, like things like pollen and dust, dander, things like that. And a lot of times there's viruses or there are bacteria stuck to those things. Well, if you're breathing through your nose, those things are caught in the turbinates and they're enveloped in mucus and they're rendered harmless. If you breathe in through your mouth, you get 100% of that. It goes right down to your alveoli. So there's a huge difference in breathing through your nose and through your mouth. The reason why we breathe a lot of times in through our mouth is because it's about 50% easier, right? So it is harder to breathe in and out through your nose, right? We feel there's that resistance in the inhale. However, this actually is perfectly suited to facilitate a functional breath. We talked about, okay, we need to expand that marble into a softball, into our abdomen. We need to activate that diaphragm. And the diaphragm is one of these interesting muscles. It's hooked up to both sides of your brain. Just in case you receive a brain injury on one side, you can still breathe, which is, that was good thinking. But it has very few muscle spindles. So it's difficult to actually say, I'm going to feel my diaphragm flex. It's not easy to do that. You can do that with most of your muscles. You've got hundreds of muscle spindles where you can really feel that flex. It's difficult to do with your diaphragm. However, if you breathe in through your nose, you're providing that resistance, and that helps to activate the diaphragm. Just like when you go lift weights, it helps to activate your muscles. When you breathe in through your nose, it helps to activate the diaphragm. And we understand that when we activate the diaphragm, we're sending messages to the unconscious that we're safe, right? Because we're breathing low and slow through the tummy, down low. So there's a lot of reasons. Now, exhaling through your nose, especially when it comes to if you're doing a conscious breathing technique, it's not that big of a deal to exhale through your mouth. And in some cases, if you're really trying to make that exhale go as long as you can, some cases it's easier to use your mouth because you can purse your lips and almost like you're breathing through a straw as you're exhaling. However, we know that if you exhale through your nose actually stays more malleable. It's not going to get stuffed up quite as much. So if you're a person who keeps getting stuffed up noses, you might be a guy like me who talks all the time, right? And so the more we use our mouth, right? I'm exhaling a lot through my mouth as I'm speaking, but if we exhale through our nose, we retain a lot of the malleability. So our nose stays more healthy if we inhale and exhale through our nose. And then lastly, I'm a nose lover. So I've got to give you all these nose facts. But lastly, if you exhale through your nose, you retain about 40% more water. So a lot of times a lot of the water that we have evaporates through our mouth. So when I train runners, one of the things we often do is we try to help them maintain nasal breathing as long as we possibly can, because we have that water plan. We want to make sure we have that hydration plan set up. So we don't want to lose that hydration any faster than we have to. So your nose is a beautiful, wonderful organ. And sometimes I get carried away talking about it, but use your nose.
Well, it's interesting you say runners, because I think using your nose when you're conscious and aware of it is one thing. And then trying to use your nose when, for example, you're doing exercise like running, is another thing. And then, of course, there's the sleeping matter. And
Yes.
that leads to this idea of whether you should tape your mouth when you sleep to
Oh boy.
absolutely ensure. So what are your thoughts on that?
So I think, as with most things, and as with most things, there is good to be done in certain cases. But I think a lot of times we as human beings say, well, if a little's good, then let's just do it all the time. During your wakeful hours, for instance, sometimes people are mouth taping while they exercise, or they're mouth taping just throughout the day when they're awake. And honestly, I mean, your lips work just fine, in my opinion, right? We can close our mouth. If for some reason you just can't break the habit of mouth breathing throughout the day, I guess, you can tape your mouth shut if you want to. But during the daytime, mouth taping is not a great thing. And there are you'll see a lot of athletes now that are getting into mouth taping. And ultimately, there is a reason why we can breathe in and out through our mouth. It's more of we might consider it to be an escape hatch. If for some reason we can't breathe out of this way, we want to make sure we're not going to suffocate. And for athletes, there are times when nasal breathing is appropriate, and there's times when mouth breathing is appropriate. But mouth taping at night, of course, you're unconscious. You can't choose to keep your mouth shut. And what this has caused in many cases, again, your unconscious is always there. It never turns off. This is why an alarm clock works, actually, because it's always listening. And it's not because you're not consciously listening for the alarm clock, but the unconscious you is always observing. And if it hears a sound that it feels is, hey, that could be danger, it's going to kick it up to your conscious self, that conscious thinking part of yourself. And it's going to say, hey, deal with this. And then you're like, huh? And that's why it works. Now, but you're having a dream, you're asleep. The unconscious part of you is like, okay, we're sleeping. It's still picking up signals. So if you're mouth breathing at night, it's very, very likely you are chest breathing at night. And when we talk about how this works within the language of our conscious and unconscious, using the language of breath, we understand that tone and inflection matter, right? Just presence matters. And so it's as if all night, if you're mouth breathing, you're breathing up in the chest, as if all night you're screaming, it's just, you're not getting a restful night's sleep. Now, when we look at the biomarkers, right? When we look at the numbers, what we see is that the result of that is that the unconscious you is keeping you in that active state, even though you are sleeping. And what that means is you might have chronically high cortisol. You may not get a good night's sleep. You might have a lot of the same biomarkers that you would have during wakeful hours under stress, you're having as you sleep. So you wake up, and this happens to an enormous amount of us. Here in the States, we love our coffee. We drink it by the gallon, and I like coffee too. I'm not gonna badmouth it because it is a thing. But so much overconsumption of caffeine happens because we're getting a terrible night's sleep. So should a person mouth tape? Well, in many cases, yes. In many cases, mouth tape can be a wonderful solution to the problem of mouth breathing at night, because you want to stop that chest breathing. You want to breathe in through the nose, so it activates the diaphragm. So you're getting that nice presence and tone in every breath. So your unconscious is like, okay, we are going to give you deep sleep. We're going to get you recovered. You're going to grow muscle. You're going to have low blood sugar throughout the night. It's going to be great tonight because it doesn't feel threatened. However, mouth taping should be done only when you know that you can actually breathe through your nose. And so when I work with clients, we make sure that is the case. And what I typically will do is I will recommend, not for a person with a hairy face like mine, but there is tape that will go around your lips. And so that way, if you just have to, you can breathe through your mouth. And the reason for that is because it's possible that if you mouth tape, I mean, I don't know if you're if it's you're doing the get in the van and shut up type of a mouth tape, right, with the duct tape, it's possible that you could suffocate yourself. So there is that, and that's not a very popular opinion in the breathwork world. But I would recommend, if you want to do mouth taping, just mouth tape the tip of your mouth or mouth tape around your mouth. Don't do the all the way across unless you're for sure that you can breathe through your nose just fine.
Okay, really interesting. Oh my gosh, I've got so many more questions, but I also know that the How To Academy audience always have amazing questions. So I'll weave them in and then come back to mine. But also this is important because it relates to what we were just saying, which is Michael says, I recall Wim Hof, who obviously, as I said at the start, you teach his techniques, trained in his techniques, recommending breathing in through the mouth if possible during his breathwork program, maybe to get more oxidation. Is that right?
So I used to be a Wim Hof instructor. I teach language of breath right now. That's my main thing. But yeah, Wim Hof was my first teacher. I trained with him for many years. We've done a lot of work together, and this is where he and we kind of disagree. Mouth breathing is not the end of the world if you do it on a specific session. So for instance, if you sit there, for instance, like a 15-minute session where your goal is hyperventilation, it's not the end of the world there. But nasal breathing is always going to be superior if you can do it appropriately. Sometimes nasal breathing is going to cause you discomfort. And that's because a lot of us we've not really used our nose very much. And so mouth breathing can be a great change to that. Now, when it comes to, for instance, when Wim Hof is doing that style of breath work, which is what we call a hyperventilative technique. So,
Yeah.
or I call superventilative
Yes. Yeah.
technique in my book. So I do superventilation with the language of breath as well. What our goal in this actually is, we're exhaling a lot of CO2 in that case. So we're inhaling a whole bunch and we're exhaling a whole bunch. And so ultimately, mouth or nose in those kinds of techniques, it mostly depends on your comfort level. The other thing is, if you stay nasal during those, you're less likely to have what I call the runaway sympathetic dominance that sometimes you can have if you're chronically going in and out through the mouth. And so what this leads to is generally a more pleasant and a more controlled session. Whereas if you only focus on mouth and you're not at least trying to use your nose on at least the inhale, then you can ramp up that nervous system really, really high and sometimes have more anxiety at the end of it as a result than even before you started the session.